They came to the coast in the clear, hopeful light of late summer. On September 13th and 14th, 1700, a storm rose from the Atlantic and struck the Carolina shore with a violence the colonies had seldom seen. September 13th, 1700, the coast of South Carolina woke under a heavy sky, but no one knew that by nightfall, the colony would face one of the deadliest storms in its short history. They would call it the Rising Sun Hurricane, a name that carried both the dawn it shattered and the great ship it destroyed. Nearly 100 lives would be lost, countless homes swept away, and an entire community forced to rebuild from nothing. Think of the settlers in Charleston, a fragile port barely 3 decades old. Their lives were built on rice fields, timber houses, and hope carried across the Atlantic. Yet that hope was tested in a single night, when winds howled with the power to tear down forests and waves surged with the strength to swallow ships whole. What made this storm unforgettable was not only its destruction, but the way it struck at the very heart of the colony's survival. At the center of the tragedy was a Rising Sun, a massive Scottish ship that lay anchored near the harbor. Already damaged, it fought to withstand the storm's force but failed. As the hurricane raged, the vessel broke apart, dragging almost every soul aboard into the sea. For the families who watched from shore, the sight of that wreck at dawn would never leave them. The image of splintered wood and lost lives became a scar written into Carolina's memory. This was more than weather. It was a reminder how vulnerable the colonies were, caught between ambition and nature's fury. It showed that history is not only shaped by kings and battles, but also by storms that decide who lives to tell the tale. Tonight, we retrace that night of terror, the winds, the waves, the wreck, and the resilience that followed. Charlestown stood at the edge of a continent that felt both generous and indifferent. Founded less than 30 years earlier, the settlement was a scattering of wooden houses, packed earth streets, and a single, uneven wharf where goods arrived and departed by the mercy of tides. Men and women here lived with constant compromise. The promise of land and profit weighed against salt air, mosquitoes, and the slow work of clearing marsh for rice. Everything depended on a thin chain of supply. Ships bringing tools, food, news, and people. Remove that link, and daily life snapped. Social life in the port was compact and public. The church bell marked hours and funerals alike. Merchants kept ledger books that recorded risk in neat columns. Planters measured success by the height of rice stubble in the fields and by the number of hands in the paling. For many, survival meant a small margin. One failed crop, 1 month without imports, could force a family to face hunger or ruin. Communities here were built on cooperation born of necessity. Neighbors loaned nails and labor. Parish records listed baptisms and deaths with similar economy, and charity was both spiritual duty and practical insurance. The town's architecture offered little protection. Houses rose on low foundations, framed in pine and cedar that swelled in humidity. Roofs were made to shrug off sun in short rains, not to withstand sustained gale. Out on the water, navigational aids were primitive. Fires on shore, buoys that shifted with the sand, piloting by memory more than by map. Mariners kept watch with the tools of experience. Observation of winds, the look of clouds, and the feel of the tide. Those senses could be reliable, but they were fallible. In a place where so much depended on seasonal weather, seasons themselves felt like a gamble. Economic life was tightly bound to the Atlantic. Ships did more than move goods. They carried news and human lives. A vessel arriving late in season could mean grain for winter. A ship delayed by a storm might strand men who were owed wages, households that went unpaid, and plans that depended on timely cargo. Insurance, when available, was limited, and risk was spread informally across families and partnerships. In that environment, every crossing carried weight. Contracts waited on safe passage, shipments paid mortgages, and the future of small enterprises hinged on uncertain voyages. There were other strains beneath the visible routines. Disease moved quickly where many lived in close quarters and medical knowledge was sparse. Labor systems were unequal and tightly enforced. Those who worked the fields had stakes very different from the merchants who counted profits at the wharf. Political ties to England shaped law and commerce, and distant decisions made in councils or on ships could reshape daily realities here. The colony held ambitions shaped by trade and by hope, but also a brittle vulnerability rooted in geography and in the limits of infrastructure. This was the world the rising sun hurricane struck. It was not a place of grand fortifications or abundant redundancies. It was a living network of dependencies. When a storm threatened, it did not merely blow at roofs. It threatened the ledgers, the supplies, the relationships that kept people fed and sheltered. That brittle interdependence made the settlement resilient in ordinary times. Neighbors assisted neighbors, crews helped crews, but also meant that a single violent night could ripple into months of hardship. As we moved closer to the night, when wind and water decided so much of the colony's fate, hold that fragility in mind. What the storm took would not be measured only in lost lives, but in interrupted livelihoods, in missed shipments, and in the many small things that stitched daily life together. The rising sun hurricane would test those threads, and the way the community responded would define the next chapter of life on this coast. The week before the hurricane arrived, the town moved with the steady rhythm of ordinary risk. Market stalls opened by dawn. Women bent over baskets of okra and corn, while men argued softly over price and weight. Children chased one another through dust and pigeon droppings. At the wharf, ropes creaked as sailors topped off barrels of salted pork and kegs of spirits. Small boats shuttled between anchored ships and the shore, carrying men who smelled of tar and seaweed. Voices low with the basic business of lives that depended on steady trade. Weather was conversation there. Folks compared the color of the horizon, the way the wind pushed at the masts, the shape of low clouds. An odd swell out beyond the bar drew remarks among the fishermen, a longer, rolling motion that made small craft ride strangely. A few captains grumbled about the tide being higher than it should be for the month. These were observations passed over mugs of ale, not warnings shouted from town squares. Mariners used experience as their instrument, reading small signs the way a farmer reads the soil. The signs were rarely decisive, and habit taught patience. The rising sun had been in port for several days before the worst of the weather. Crew and passengers moved on and off her deck. Merchants ran final inventories, measuring how much cargo could be shipped inland that day. There was talk of a dismasting on an earlier run, a misfortune repaired with haste, but such damage was not uncommon. Ships carried the marks of voyages like scars. Patched sails replaced planks, a history of weather written in rigging. For many, a damaged mast was manageable, something to be fixed before the next crossing. On quieter mornings, the shore gave up small rituals that felt timeless. Men swept the wharf, dogs nosed through piles of rope, and women checked linen for salt stains. The smell of smoke from cooking fires mixed with salt on the air. A bell tolled for mid-morning prayer. Voices rose, brief and matter-of-fact. These rituals did not deny risk so much as accept it. Life continued because it must. When work delayed a shipment or a shillings payment came late, people adapted. Flexibility was survival. There were, too, private movements that hinted at vulnerability. Some planters hurried to shelter livestock on higher ground. A merchant counted his coins more closely, worrying about a long voyage that might never return. A handful of passengers, Scots who had failed a recent colonial venture in Panama, lingered at the edge of town, thin and watchful, grateful for any berth or meal. Their presence added a quieter tension. People already displaced, searching for new starts, depending on the same fragile currents as everyone else. Even with small warnings, life kept its rhythms. Sailors above deck checked ropes and trimmed sails as if routine could steady the sea. Children chased crabs at low tide. A preacher visited families, offering word of caution and comfort in equal measure. The town assumed it could absorb small shocks. Repairs would be made, losses counted, and gratitude offered for survival. That assumed resilience is what made the coming collapse so devastating. The town's daily steadiness, its bargaining, its small kindnesses, its reliance on routines, became the baseline against which the storm's violence would be measured. The ordinary act of the week before made the loss more visible. A barrel left untended, a market stall with fewer goods, a sailor who did not return to his berth. When the wind finally rose, the contrast between the normal and the catastrophic would sharpen every cut. On the last clear afternoon, as light slanted low and men tied down cargo, the sea gave a final, subtle signal. Birds flew low over the water. A pilot on the bar frowned at a shift in current. No one could have known how quickly the ordinary would break. What looked like routine at the moment would become the last memory for many, a snapshot of calm that lasted until first true gust arrived and altered everything. Dusk narrowed into a thin band of light, and the air lost its easy warmth. At first the change was small. Ropes hummed with a different pitch, and the smell of salt sharpened as if the sea itself were drawing breath. Mariners ran hands over wet lines and checked knots with practiced motions. On the wharf, voices dropped. Conversations that had been about price and labor shortened to curt orders. There was no single alarm, only a series of small corrections. Masts secured, shutters latched, barrels tied down. Actions meant to buy time. The horizon began to darken in strips, clouds stacking from the ocean inward. The swell swelled, making small boats tack awkwardly. Fishermen muttered to one another, trading gestures that had the force of warnings. An experienced pilot who had guided ships across the bar for years paused longer than usual, his jaw set, then turned away as if reluctant to say aloud what he suspected. For many, the decision was to wait and watch, the ancient practice of sailors who balance caution with the need to keep trade moving. Then the wind shifted into something sharper. It came in pulses at first, gusts that pushed at a person's shoulders and left foam on the lips. Lanterns swung and guttered. Men who had spent long days on deck found their footing tested on piles of wet timber. A few men ran haul in smaller craft, hands raw from rope, their breath visible in the cooled air. The sound of the town narrowed into a new rhythm. The slap of canvas, the creak of timbers, the distant groan of something under strain. As evening deepened, the weather stopped being a background condition and became an active force. Trees began to list and shudder under persistent pressure. Roof tiles loosened and skittered. Shutters that had been nailed down groaned as the wind found purchase. On the outskirts, fields near the marsh showed the first signs of water inching beyond known bounds. Livestock low in the meadows lifted their heads, uneasy and sought higher ground. People moved with purposeful but cautious energy, doing the tasks they had rehearsed in minds more than practice. Securing animals, retrieving bedding, gathering children. On board the rising sun, crew tightened what they could. The ship had been patched and made ready, but earlier damage left it vulnerable. Sailors hauled lines with a sense of urgency that now had the edge of fear. Passengers who had come ashore scrambled back as waves began to lash the outer hull. The vessel pitched and rolled against its anchors. Men shouted, orders and prayers tangled into the same breath. Small groups clustered against wet planks, eyes on the water and on the shore, where forms moved like slow lanterns. Signals were attempted. Flares shouted instructions, a bell struck hard. Yet the sea began to insist on its own tempo. Waves grew taller between the beats of wind, and the surge pushed farther into the lowlands than anyone had marked that afternoon. The bar shifted. Channels that had guided boats for months altered under the strain. In some places, a narrow creek widened as salt water pushed upriver, swallowing fence lines and gardens in a single, hungry reach. By nightfall, the first real fear took root. What had begun as corrective measures was failing to match the speed and scale of the storm. The clever improvisations of sailors and the steady routines of townsfolk were being outpaced by a force that forced decisions into an urgent register. Rescue, if it came, would have to be immediate and improvisational. Waiting would no longer be an option. When the first major gust struck with sustained violence, it broke the last small commotion into a clear emergency. Lanterns went out. Men shouted orders that could no longer be heard. The town's calm was gone in a handful of blows, replaced by a relentless, elemental insistence. In that sudden change, so swift and so absolute, the true test began. Who could move fast enough, who could find safety, and who would be left to count what they no longer had. Dark arrived with a hardness that felt physical. Wind no longer flirted with the town. It pressed, it shoved, it reached into rooms and dragged at people as if it could find the pulse of a house. Lanterns stuttered and failed. Voices were small against the storm's rising sound, a continuous, thudding roar that swallowed rhythm and speech. In that noise, ordinary distinctions collapsed, market and chapel, wharf and field. All were folded into the single task of holding on. On the wharf, men who had handled ropes since boyhood moved with a new, savage urgency. They tied lines until fingers were raw, shouting orders clipped and sharp. Shouts slid into prayers where men could no longer be certain which would help more. Water hammered against pilings until timber screamed. A few smaller craft, lashed together and weighted, were swept broadside as if a giant hand rolled them like pebbles. The scent of tar and smoke mixed with brine. Each breath tasted of salt and fear. Closer to the center of the chaos, the rising sun rode on a sea that had become a machine for tearing things apart. The ship pitched and heaved. Her damaged spars caught the wind like broken arms. Men tried to keep her from being driven ashore, but anchors dragged in shifting sand, and ropes that held steady against ordinary weather snapped under the new load. Steam of effort rose from crew backs. Passengers clung to rails or leaned into one another, voices raw from shouting, faces wet with spray and with rain. Orders were shouted and lost in wind. Practical decisions and pleas for mercy braided into a single, urgent language. Waves rose higher than memory, forming walls that moved inland with speed that shocked those who watched. Low-lying yards vanished beneath water that smelled of sea and mud. Fences that had stood for years were torn away like splints. Cattle and sheep, once tethered in fields, were frantic and helpless as water reached across meadows. People who had run to higher ground found it not always safe. The surge rolled farther than maps suggested, swallowing paths and leaving bewildered survivors stranded on narrow rises. Houses that had been secure a few hours before became cages. Roofs lifted or collapsed. Timber frames splintered. Nails groaned. Families clutched one another in cramped interiors, hearing the storm's violence through roofs and shutters. Some had time to knot a rope around a post and hold through the worst. Others woke to the shock of water breaking into living rooms, belongings floating like strange, silent witnesses. In the dark, a child's cry cut through the night, and the sound lodged in neighbors' ears, a single note that will return to memory for years. Rescue was improvisation under pressure. Men launched small skiffs when they could, their hands blistered, driven by a simple, blunt insistence to pull someone from the water. Lanterns bobbed like wounded stars as crews rowed against a current made of wind and tide. In those fragile vessels, people reached for what they could, a hand on a floating plank, a head breaking the water, the weight of another human pulled into a boat. Some rescue succeeded. Others ended with the cold silence of the sea, taking its due. Amid the chaos were moments of raw, human clarity. A fisherman, soaked and exhausted, passed his coat to a shivering woman whose child had been pulled from a flooded yard. A group of men, saw blades useless in weather, used oars and sheer would pry open a door and drag a family onto higher ground. Small acts of care cut through the overwhelming scale of loss, making the night story not only about ruin, but about what people did for one another when everything else failed. At dawn, the landscape that returned to sight was altered beyond quick repair. Where trees had stood was broken forest. Where the wharf had been was a scatter of planks and barrels. On the nearest sandbar, the rising sun lay in pieces. Her timbers, once a proud bulk of wood and hope, were now a jagged outline against pale sky. Bodies washed up along stretches of shore. Families counted and found absences that made the next day a slow, aching arithmetic. The night was not only a moment of destruction. It was the point at which private routines dissolved into a public emergency. The scale of the event was measured in small, unforgettable scenes. A plank with a child's shawl, a ledger book sodden and illegible, a pair of boots stuck in mud. These fragments made the lost concrete. For survivors, for those who rode until their hands cracked, and for those who knelt by the newly dug graves, the hurricane was now a living, terrible fact to be named and carried forward. When the wind finally dropped, it left a stunned calm. Sound returned as a patchwork of cries and the odd, stunned laughter of relief. People stepped out, blinking into a ruined morning. They would bury the dead, tally losses, and begin the slow work of deciding what to salvage and what had to be left behind. The night's terror had taken its toll, but it also revealed the contours of compassion and endurance that would shape recovery. The rising sun occupied the harbor, like a promise no one wanted to test. Built for long crossings, she had the bulk of an ocean-going merchantman. High sides, broad deck, deep hold. But recent weather had left her less than whole. Her mainmast had been damaged on an earlier passage, and though patched, It carried the history of strain. That history became urgent when the hurricane arrived. The ship's previous wounds made her less able to meet a storm that demanded every seam and spar to hold true. As the wind grew, those aboard the Rising Sun moved through a set of actions that sailors know by muscle rather than thought. Lines were doubled, loose cargo was lashed, the anchors were checked. Passengers who had crossed the ocean in search of work or a new start gathered near the lee of the mainmast, voices low, attempting to calm that weather refused to grant. On shore, people watched as a dark shape rolled on the waves, a hulking presence with men clinging to its rails like a human ring around wood. Anchors, designed to bite into sand, struggled as the bar changed. The sea's motion shifted the bed beneath them. The sand that had once held firm became a sliding partner under the ropes. At first, anchors dragged slowly, a grinding refusal under the hull. Then, as gusts sharpened and the surge rose, the ship listed and her bow turned toward the open water, like an animal seeking an escape it could not reach. Men shifted weight, hauled with hands at new port and rope, but every pull met a new force. Ropes frayed and snapped, the sound loose and final in the wind. Waves were higher than memory and came in a rhythm that belied mercy. One struck the Rising Sun with the force of battering ram, throwing spray across deck and washing men off their feet. Timber groaned where fastening strained. In the chaos, a stray line wrapped around a belaying pin and pulled wrong. A small mistake had consequences magnified by weather. Below deck, crates shifted, the cargo inside banging like trapped things. Passengers who had hoped the ship would carry them safely inland found their world reduced to a small span of wood and rope between sky and sea. At a critical moment, the anchors lost purchase entirely. The vessel, no longer held, began to be carried by the combined will of wind and tide. She drifted toward a shelf of sand that runs near the bar, a place sailors respect for its danger. When the hull grounded, the impact was violent enough to jolt people to silence for a breath. The ship shuddered, rolled as if tested for splits, and then found a precarious stillness that allowed only a short reprieve. The bar's shallow teeth and the hurricane's repeated blows worked together to punish the Rising Sun. As water pushed beneath the hull from an unexpected angle, planks that had been dry for years met salt and pressure in a new way. Timbers began to fret, caulking loosened. Inboard, passengers and crew heard the small, terrifying noises of a vessel beginning to fail, a seam separating under strain, a mast coming under a load it could not bear. Men lashed themselves to posts or to one another, conscience and training braided into a single action. When a mast finally broke free, it did so with a sound like a great gasp. Spars fell, ripping canvas and shattering chants. The falling timber punched holes in deck and lifeboat davits. It turned the ship's deck into a dangerous landscape of jagged wood and slippery rope. Those who had not been washed overboard found their footing gone. Some threw themselves toward the rail, attempting to reach the relative safety of the shore's rising land. Others were carried away by a breaking wave before their hands could find a new hold. Witnesses on the beach later described a scene of horrifying clarity, a mass of wreckage rolling and spitting, men clinging to fragments, the moonless sky lit only by the occasional flare of a lantern. Small boats put out despite the odds, oars biting into water that offered more resistance than usual. Rowers fought to reach floating timber, to pull a body into a skiff, to snatch a child from a plank. Those boats succeeded in pulling some to safety, a handful at a time, while others were overtaken by the sea's appetite. When dawn arrived, the Rising Sun no longer rode as a whole vessel. She lay broken where the bar had taken her. Ribs exposed, cargo strewn like a scattered life. The scene was a raw geometry of loss. Lines of splintered wood, slumped sails, personal items caught in tidal pools. Bodies washed up on stretches of sand with clothing clinging. Hands clenched as if unaware the fight was over. On the wharf, those who had watched the night counted faces against names, surrendering to the slow arithmetic of grief. The wreck became an anchor in local memory, not only for what was lost, but for how people responded. Salvage parties worked to recover what they could. Crates of goods, an occasional chest, a ledger swollen but legible enough to be patched. Survivors told of being pulled from floating timbers by strangers who bent a tireless night into a narrow mission of rescue. The Rising Sun's fate was a puncture in the town's sense of safety. proof that even large, well-built things could fail when nature applied its full measure. As the community sorted debris into what might be saved and what must be buried, the image of that ruined hull on the bar became a constant. It was a visible reminder that the colony's link to the outside world could be suddenly severed, and that the ocean's decisions could be cruel in their finality. The shipwreck grounded the story, a terrible, physical marker, a night that no ledger, no sermon could fully account for. When morning broke fully, the town moved through a grief measured by tasks. Mourning took shape in small, urgent actions. Bodies wrapped in cloth and carried to shallow graves, wet garments gathered into piles to be burned or dried, lists compiled of names and missing kin. The count of the dead never reached neat closure. Parish registers filled with annotations. Relatives wrote letters that began and stopped as memory failed them. Contemporary reports settled near one grim total, roughly 100 souls lost, but that number could not capture the everyday absences: a neighbor who did not come to market, a table place left empty, a child's lullaby fading in the mind of a parent. The economic ripple followed quickly. Warehouses found their floors layered with sand and seawater. Barrels of salted meat burst, and rice and loaf sheds lay sodden and useless. Merchants killed their losses on ledgers, and added repair costs with a hand that trembled. Ships bound for inland ports lay unusable or delayed. Insurance, when it existed, covered only a part of loss and seldom the full human toll. Planters faced ruined crops that promised months of hardship for field laborers and households alike. For many families, the storm meant a year of tighter belts, of postponed marriages and delayed apprenticeships. Social structures bent, but did not break. Churches served as centers for both mourning and practical relief. Ministers organized collections of grain and fabric. Neighbors opened spare rooms to those whose houses had been swept away. Women arranged kitchens to feed crews working on salvage. In the days after the storm, whole streets became places of shared work. Clearing wreckage, tending the wounded, nursing the sick who had contracted fever in the cold, damp aftermath. Those acts of help were not grand ceremonies but steady labor. Hauling again, and setting stones where foundations had been scoured by water. Legal and commercial disputes surfaced as salvage began. Claims were made on cargo. Arguments sprang up about rights to wrecked goods that lay half-buried in sand. Some salvage parties recovered chests and crates. Others were accused of taking more than they should. These quarrels were practical and bitter, rooted in scarcity. The law, tied to distant ports and slow courts, moved at a pace that often frustrated those who needed immediate resolution. Letters went out to England and to other colonies, asking for assistance and reporting losses. Ship owners tallied crew lists and filed petitions. Affected families waited for remittances that might not arrive in time to bury the dead decently or to pay debts coming due. The wider mercantile network wobbed. A delay of a single schooner could affect prices in markets far away and send credit tight in its wake. Grief had a private face in the town's households. Parents folded small garments and kept them in chests as relics. A widow counted coins and decided whether to pay for a headstone. Men who had rowed all night found themselves unable to sleep, haunted by the hands they had not saved. Children learned the new names of people who had been neighbors and then were not. The psychological aftershock settled into daily routines. Quieter steps along the shore, fewer children at certain play spots, a lull in the laughter that once filled particular rooms. Recovery began with the labor of reclaiming what could be used. Salvage crews pried apart wreckage for timber and rope. Craftsmen mended roofs and built coffins. The wharf was rebuilt in stages, a little stronger in places, with added piles because people could not afford the same risk twice. Yet rebuilding was necessarily uneven. Those with means repaired faster, while poorer households patched and waited. By the time the first planting season after the storm arrived, the town had patched many visible wounds. Yet the less visible costs remained. Slower trade, the memory of who did not come home, a cautiousness in shipping schedules. The rising sun hurricane did not erase hope, but altered calculations for years. When a sale would replace houses, how to store grain against water's return. In that altered calculus, the community learned to measure risk more carefully and to value the small acts that once felt ordinary: a neighbor's loan of nails, a farmer's extra bundle of seed, a boat crew ready to row at any hour. The rising sun hurricane left more than broken timbers and flooded fields. It altered how a community thought about its future. In the days and months that followed, decisions were made with a new, practical urgency. Foundations were raised where possible. Wharves were rebuilt with heavier piles, and craftsmen who had bent nails for years learned to reinforce joints against surge. The changes were not dramatic blueprints drawn in a grand hall. They were small, accumulative improvements shaped by people who had learned the cost of underestimating the sea. Mariners adjusted their practices. Pilots who guided ships across the bar kept stricter logs of currents and sand shifts, and they passed stories of the night from one generation to the next as a kind of living chart. Captains changed routes and timing when possible, choosing to wait for more favorable tides rather than risk a late crossing. The loss of the rising sun became a lesson in redundancy. More anchors, better lashings, closer attention to worn rigging. Those choices did not stop storms, but they reduced blind risk and improved the odds for vessels that followed. Economically, the storm exposed fragile points in supply chains. Merchants and planters moved to diversify storage and spread crucial goods across multiple sites where feasible. A single flooded warehouse no longer meant immediate ruin for a household when grain and cloth were held in separate places. Creditors and insurers adjusted expectations. Where possible, letters of credit and partnerships were reworked to allow for the interruptions nature could cause. These were practical seams sewn into commerce so that the next shock would not snap everything at once. The hurricane also left cultural traces. Stories about the night populated sermons and hearthside talk, carrying names and small acts of courage into local memory. The wreck of the rising sun became a common reference in conversations about risk, a shorthand for what happens when preparation meets misfortune. Families kept relics, a fragment of rope, a sodden ledger page, and those objects helped younger listeners understand the human shape of the event. Memory here was not merely nostalgia. It was a primer in communal survival. Law and customs shifted too. Salvage disputes forced local authorities to refine rules about wreck rights and property claims, and those legal clarifications reduced friction in later recoveries. Parish and civic leaders organized reserves of grain and fuel, informal at first and later more organized, recognizing that mutual aid could be the difference between modern recovery and a prolonged crisis. Religious leaders couched these measures in moral language, urging charity. Practical men described them as insurance bought with neighborly labor. There is a wider lesson in how this community responded. The hurricane made clear that vulnerability need not be permanent. Where capacity and will aligned, people rebuilt with incremental improvements that mattered. Where inequality persisted, recovery was slower and more uncertain. The better-off fixed roofs and replaced cargo, while poorer households patched and waited. That unequal pace shaped the town's future social geography. Some streets regained bustle quickly, others lagged, and the map of resilience often matched lines of wealth. Finally, the rising sun hurricane underscores a historical truth about weather and memory. Instruments and observation have advanced since 1700, but the core human responses, tending the wounded, arguing over scarce goods, passing down warnings, remain constant across centuries. Events like this do not vanish into footnotes. They shape cultural prudence, legal practice, and the built environment. The night of wind and water became part of the colony's identity, a remembered trial that taught caution, prompted cooperation, and left a visible scar on coast and community. When we close this chapter, the lesson is plain and humane. Disasters reveal both weakness and strength. They show where systems fail and where human hands, unglamorous and tireless, mend what they can. The rising sun hurricane was a brutal test, but also prompted changes, small, stubborn, and often unseen, that help a fragile port endure. History keeps the record of loss, but it also records how people answer loss. And in that answer we find the most lasting traces. Altered roofs, altered routes, and the stories pass from one voice to the next so that the next generation might choose differently.